Why is sovereignty so often the missing link when it comes to walking the path of the soul? Well, in this week's episode, I'm joined by past guest, the wonderful Rod Boothroyd. Rod brings more than 2 decades of experience of working with men and women to his current work as a healing the shadow practitioner. In this episode, we delve into the concept of the sovereign within and its transformative implications for leadership, personal growth, and soul awakening. We explore the essence of heart centered leadership, including the importance of compassion and self love, share insights into the archetypes of inflated and deflated shadows, highlighting their manifestations in everyday life, reflect on the pivotal role of purpose in anchoring a strong sense of self, and talk about the dynamics of childhood experiences and how these early influences sculpt our path to embodying sovereignty. And before we jump into all of that good stuff, if you are struggling with the challenges of walking your soul path in this crazy modern world and you would benefit from guidance, support, and kinship, come join our Academy of the Soul Unio. You can find out more and join us by hopping on over to bemythical.com/unio now. And now back to this week's episode. Let's dive in. Hello, Rod. A huge warm welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. And we've got so much to talk about. I just hope this is going to be as fascinating to everybody listening as it is to you and me, because we've had quite a chat about it before we began.
Yes, absolutely. This is definitely a topic that you and I could geek out on for hours, if not years. So, I think it clearly needed there to be this kind of like two-parter, because last time our intention probably was to have the conversation we're intending to have this time, but it turns out we ended up going much deeper, I think, into the four archetypes as a whole. And of course, some of your story and kind of how this has shown up for both of us along the way. And we didn't end up focusing as much as we'd intended on this, the leader within, the sovereign within. So we now would like to restore the sovereign to their rightful place, the throne at the center, and go. I mean, we very much touched on that last time, but this time very much go very deeper into that. And all the different ways that shows up kind of in the collective and also within the individual. So, yes, let's see if we can stay kind of on track.
I'm sure we can. With enough sovereign energy, we'll get there.
Wonderful. So let's begin. And again, we definitely touched on this last time, but now again, with the idea that this, could be a standalone episode, as much as I would suggest listeners listen to the last one first. Let's start with defining what is meant with the leader within.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe the first thing to say is that a lot of people don't like these traditional terms for the archetypes. And this one we're talking about, of course, is traditionally known as the king or queen or sovereign. And of course, that's got bad associations for people. You think back in history, the likes of Henry VIII and Richard III and all the rest of them, they were not what I would describe as mature kings. Mm-hmm. So this has evolved into the concept, as you rightly say, Leanne, of the heart-centered leader. And this emphasizes everything about it, that this is leadership not just about self. It's leadership of whatever constitutes your world, and it's a particular form of leadership. It's heart-centered, meaning it's for the benefit not just of yourself, but for all the people and things for which you're responsible. So in a case, I think we could describe it as first among equals, that it's not just about the leader, it's about the followers as well. They're regarded as having equal importance. And yet at the same time, somehow the heart-centered leader has to maintain some degree of separation. So essentially, it's about having a respectful attitude to those for whom you're responsible and regarding their welfare as important as your own. I think that's a fairly reasonable description.
Wonderful.
thumbnail
Yes.
description. Yeah.
And my sense is what you've just said, and I think you mentioned this, but really that description applies to the kind of inner workings as much as the outer workings.
What do you mean exactly?
As in, as we were talking about in the last episode, this notion of those core archetypes, such as the action taker, the
Ah,
warrior,
yes, of course.
and then the relationship between that inner leader and the warrior, I think much to a large extent could be described in the way that you're talking about, as well as, say, for example, a mother and her children. It
Oh,
feels to me there is like a very similar relationship that's happening on the inside as well as the outside, and probably needs to happen first on the inside before it can manifest in that aligned way externally.
absolutely no question of that whatsoever. So if you think of the concept of heart-centered leadership, it's almost self-defining, isn't it? Heart-centered, we know what that means
Mm,
intuitively. It means compassion, it means love, it means respect, and of course it also means authority, but it's authority tempered by love, compassion, respect, appreciation, all those other softer qualities. So,
mm,
yes, if you can't bring those qualities to your own inner world, how on earth are you going to bring them to your outer world? And one representation of that, I think, that's very on point these days is the question of you can't bring love or compassion to people around you, not in a genuine, heart centered way at least, if you can't bring it to yourself.
mm,
And interestingly enough, this whole idea of heart-centered leadership started in the world of business and industry in the 70s with Robert Greenleaf, whose view was that autocratic leadership, as in, I tell you what to do and you do it and don't answer me back because I'm in charge around here, was actually not an effective way of running a business. That actually,
mm,
if you offered people the opportunity to contribute to what they were doing and respected their views and gave them serious consideration, they would actually perform a lot better. And the environment that they were in would be much more pleasant to be in. And
mm.
so from
It's funny
that,
actually how radical that probably sounded. Like now, it's like, of course, but yet there was that was radical then.
it was absolutely, he
Mm,
was, I think, not really taken very seriously for quite a long time. It was
mm,
Susan Steinbrecher, I believe, who brought this into the 20th century, 21st century, I should say, in a more acceptable format, in
mm,
line with the expectations of the times. Yeah, so good point. Good point. Yeah.
mm. And these it seems to me often these archetype ideas, energies that we most need initially seem extreme, initially seem radical. And it's funny, actually, it occurs to me, I don't know if you'd agree, that whilst we have to a large extent understood and adopted, again, to an extent, this more kind of conscious, heart centered form of leadership in business, I still feel as though there is a kind of gap in awareness in terms of how that could show up for us personally in our inner world and in our lives. It's interesting, isn't it? It's like that idea of a heart centered leadership often just isn't something that the average person feels applies to them.
No, I'm sad to say I think that's right. And then, of course, the question becomes, well, why?
Mm,
So here's a little vignette that might go some way to explaining it. So I was waiting for my wife yesterday, parked in the car park of the supermarket, and this chap, who is obviously angry, pushes his trolley back to his van. And there's a little girl in the trolley. I would think she was probably 4 or less. And she's quiet, but he slams the door of the van and she starts crying. And then, in response to her tears, he forcefully removes her from the trolley, forcefully puts her in the child's seat and belts her up. And by this time, she's screaming, of course, because she's lost any sense of connection with him and she's in total
Mm.
distress. He slams the door, reverses out, nearly backs into his wife, who's just arriving. She, too, has a really angry face. In they get, not a word spoken, and off he drives at high speed. Now, that's just a little vignette, and of course we don't know
Mm.
what happened before and we don't know what happened afterwards. But to me, it really wrenched my heart seeing that, because what I assume from that little vignette that's repeated so many millions of times a day is that that girl is learning all kinds of things about herself, and none of them are good, because she will
Mm.
be assuming that they're behaving in that way because of her. That's what children do 90% or perhaps even 95% of the time. They assume what's going on around them, with their parents in particular, is because of them. So
Mm.
she'll be coming to the conclusion there's something wrong with her. She's not likable. She's not lovable. Who knows what? But she will be coming to some conclusion that directly impacts her capacity in later life to believe in her strength of leadership, strength of personality, qualities that would allow her to be a leader. So
Mm.
in that vignette, I think in a way, we have a lot of the answer to the implicit question, why are there so few heart-centered leaders, or indeed
Mm.
leaders of any
Yes.
kind? We are
Yeah.
not brought up in a way that would encourage us to develop those traits.
Mm. Yes, and they don't just manifest on their own. So do you think
Sadly
this
not.
would be a good time to look at what's present instead? And we could look at that through the other archetypes, as indeed we did last time, where kind of, for example, the magician takes hold and feels like, oh, I need to run this world. But I would love to again keep focused on this archetype of I personally love the kind of more ancient archetypal language of the sovereign king and queen, so I'll probably come back and use that sometimes, but this idea of the leader within, um and when we look out at the world, the fact that we do still see, archetypes are by their very nature universal. They're happening all the time. Is whether we're conscious to them. So what I'd love to look at is the ways that can express in this more shadow expression, what we might call kind of inflated and deflated, like out in the world, like real people that might be a little bit kind of caricatures of those things. I think that would be an interesting exploration.
Yeah, super. Well, let's dive right in. So what occurs to me straight away is that the primary quality that sustains a sovereign, yeah, I like the archetypal language as the traditional language as well, king or queen, sovereign, whatever you want to call it, is one particular thing, which is a sense of being good enough.
Mm,
Now, that's quite subtle because it's not about being good at something. It's about an existential state of being that you just know you are good enough.
mhm,
Now, I mentioned the story last time of the Singaporean girl, woman, I should say. Excuse my disrespectful description of her as a girl. She was a mature woman on a workshop who said when she took a test home from school, she got 98%. Her father would say, if you'd tried harder, you'd have got 100%. Never
mhm,
once praised her for anything except achievement. If he'd said something like, okay, it doesn't matter what score you get in the test, you're still a brilliant girl and you can do anything you want or whatever, a kind of very different
mm,
approach to achievement, she would have incorporated into her sense of self something like, yeah, you know what, I might not have done very well at that, but actually that doesn't affect my sense of who I am.
mm.
So, well, let's bring it around to people in the real world and let's be a bit controversial, although I suspect most of your listeners won't find this controversial at all. Donald Trump.
Mhm,
You say, I personally think that Donald Trump is an inflated sovereign, massively inflated, perhaps the most grossly inflated sovereign we've had since Well, name another dictator, Stalin, Hitler. But the question is why? He's
Mm.
autocratic. He's definitely not heart-centered. We know that from all the evidence that's been presented to us. And yet he has a massive following. So what on earth is going on?
Mm.
Well, I think the answer is, if you read his life story, he was so abused in his childhood. His father, in particular, was a brutal man. And I
Oh,
think
I didn't
Trump,
know that. It makes sense, but I had no idea. Mm.
same is true of Hitler, incidentally. He
Oh.
suffered massively, massively,
Mm.
being compressed, not just compressed, but squashed, destroyed psychically,
Mm.
I would say. So that any sort of incipient potential king energy, sovereign energy that he had was completely squashed. Completely squashed. Now, one of the responses to the suppression of any archetypal energy is inflation, and one is
Mm.
deflation. And you never really know which way it's going to go because the energy, as you rightly say, Leanne, is still there, it's intrinsic in us. But in the case of people like Trump, what you get is an inflation that is just about equivalent to the compression of that energy in the first place. It's an
Mm.
attempt to compensate. And so what Trump's behaviour, to my mind, covers up is a massive deficit of self-esteem. Well, I don't think he has
Mm.
any self-esteem whatsoever. I just think it's non-existent. And everything that he projects into the world is an attempt to somehow reclaim his power.
Mm-hmm.
And look at him. I mean, he's a tyrant and a demagogue. He's actually said that. I'll be a tyrant from day one if I'm elected. So there's no illusion in his mind about what his kind of leadership will be.
Mm. Has he actually used that word? How fascinating. Because that is often literally the word used for that shadow expression of the archetype. Is That's fascinating, isn't it?
Kings who take power in the way that Trump might and Hitler did are called demagogues. And demagoguery is using a democratic system to get elected and then to pass laws which eliminate any potential rivalry or a different kind of leader being elected.
Mm.
People have said if Trump's elected, it's the end of America. Well, it's the end of democracy for sure, until something dramatic maybe restores it in the future.
Mm. That's interesting. Mm.
In Germany, it was a world war that restored democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Pray that that doesn't happen again. But that demagoguery is the taking of power in a democratic election and then becoming the tyrannical dictator.
Mm-hmm.
So look at the massive deflation of sovereign energy and the massive impact that it has potentially on not just America, but the world in general. And there you have
Mm.
a real life example of an extreme, extreme example of inflation.
Mm. It's actually very helpful to have, as much as there's clearly all sorts of impacts that we wouldn't choose. It's actually helpful to have these kind of larger than life expressions of this archetypal energy, because it makes it so much easier to go, oh, I get that. There is a kind of like imprint that happens that we can then
Mm,
recognize in self, but also others in a perhaps a less extreme form.
yeah,
There is a kind of almost like cartoon like aspect of Trump that is probably not something you're going to see, every day, because of its extreme nature, but you're going to see like a flavor of that. And, whether that's in our family members, whether that's at the workplace, at school, I think we can recognize those sort of similar traits that have shown
yeah,
up in people we've known. I've got a particular family member that comes to mind now, and it's it's interesting. I mean, at the time when I was younger, because of the relationship and how it affected me in difficult ways, I didn't have the understanding to see that was what was playing out for him. Now, with the kind of understanding of these things, it's really helpful to look back and recognize, oh, this was not personal to me at all. This was him playing out that very repression and then over it like inflation, because of that need to kind of feel some sense of self, some sense of worth. And so there is something helpful in being able to sort of see that in others that we've perhaps experienced the negative impacts of it from.
Well, of course, he is an extreme example. That's absolutely true. But there is one more thing that I think needs to be said. The question, of course, might well be, but why does he have such support? And the answer is, he has support from people who see themselves as powerless. In other words, people who have no sovereign of their own. He's the grotesquely inflated example of leadership, which somehow they want to be a part of, because there is no internal leadership of any kind, or at least it's so deflated that they don't feel like they're in control of their own lives. So they project whatever power they have, which will be in shadow, outwards onto a figurehead, and therefore he rises not just because of his own inflation, but because of the projections of 50 million people or 70 million people or whatever it is.
Yes,
Quite
it's a really
extraordinary.
important thing. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
sorry, that leads us naturally into the question, well, why do 75 million people feel so powerless and so sovereignless that they will support a tyrant? Now, there's the real question for us in society, because sadly that probably encompasses a lot of people listening to this podcast. And, you and I, to a degree, I mean, I wouldn't describe myself as a completely balanced sovereign at all. So, interesting question. And I think the answer comes back. We were not brought up to be sovereigns. It's as simple as that.
Yes, and it rarely, if ever, kind of just will happen on its own. So do you have an example? And again, I think there is, all the examples in the way that you've spoken about this deflated archetype is very commonplace. In some ways, maybe more commonplace than the inflated version. But do you have an example of a kind of extreme kind of celebrity example, or an example from, I don't know, film or book, someone that we could kind of look at in the way that we have just with Trump to sort of see the characteristics?
Good or bad?
Could be either, just as long as they're deflated.
Okay. Well, by definition, Leanne, the thing about deflated sovereigns is that they're not really very visible. One of their chief characteristics is that they hide. So I don't think I can bring something to mind that easily or that quickly. So if you think about the qualities of a deflated sovereign, they don't feel they're good enough. They don't feel they have the capacity to lead. They probably don't want to be seen. They probably have no concept of how to relate to others in a heart-centered way. And if they lead at all, it's probably in a very autocratic way. So I suppose if we were to look at autocratic leaders, that might take us somewhere else. Trump's one side of the equation. What about those leaders whose sovereignty is deflated? How about Boris Johnson?
He seems too similar to me to Trump to be the opposite end. I understand where you're going. There is a difference, but I would still feel as though there is a more inflation than not.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a difficult question to answer.
And again, of course, all of this is our own subjective opinion, but I think an interesting
Absolutely.
exploration nonetheless.
Yeah. No, I can't. I don't think I can honestly answer that question in the moment. But I do think there is a bit about Boris that he was switching from deflated to inflated quite a bit, I think, because, he either by design or because it was authentic, he did adopt a sort of blustering, modest persona at times, didn't he? It's like, I wonder if those were the moments where he was feeling that he genuinely wasn't good enough for what he was doing, because he was intellectually far inferior to many of the people that he met who could outwit him quite quickly. And that's the kind of trigger that can send somebody into a deflated spiral. I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer. What do you think?
Yeah. I was pondering, I haven't got a particular character that comes to mind at the moment, but I was sort of thinking through sort of mythical examples and ones from folk tales, of perhaps kind of those reluctant kings or queens that kind of didn't step into their power until there was a kind of real calling to it. There isn't a kind of a name that comes to mind at the moment, but I'm thinking like that's definitely an arc that you see repeated in stories where there is this kind of need to kind of take their power because of they've been deflated. And I was also thinking about how that shows up in, well, both in families within parents, where you may have a parent, often they'll kind of come together, you'll have like a more in fact, in the example I was giving earlier about a family member, that it kind of worked because there was a kind of inflated is sovereign in one, and then in their partner are deflated, and so it kind of, it meant that it kind of worked. It didn't work, it wasn't functional, but it allowed it to keep happening because the deflated partner wouldn't kind of stand up to them, and so
Yes.
the rule carried on in the way that it had. So I think you absolutely see that in families, again, often with a kind of mother and father taking one or the other position. But I was thinking about the times I've seen that in the world of work, in business, particularly in the corporate setting, where you absolutely will get the inflated sovereign, but there's also the deflated ones, the people pleasing
Hmm.
bosses, the ones that are can't make a decision because they're constantly kind of wanting their team to make it for them, or to kind of just put off making a decision because they don't want to kind of stand for something. So I was thinking that is something that's, I think, fairly common.
I think you're right, and I suspect lots of people listening to this will actually have that experience of having worked with the person who can't be seen, can't
Mm,
stand up, can't present an opinion clearly, doesn't feel good enough for the job. That's the truth of it. I mean,
mm,
any person who doesn't feel good enough for the job they're in might be a deflated sovereign. And it
mm.
could be, of course, they're just in a job that's beyond their capacity. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to reflect. We only see, at least on a world stage, the effects of the inflation, I think. Or we see
Mm,
much more of it than the deflated. And in a way, that's quite understandable because it's the people who are drawn to that inflation who are the most visible and
yes.
actually
Mm,
create the most havoc, unfortunately,
mm,
as perhaps you might conclude from the state of the world at the moment.
mm.
We're not being led by sovereigns.
Yeah. So now we've got those, I think, fairly clear examples of those two extremes. Let's talk about how they may show up for an individual, in like internally, and perhaps a little bit more subtly, because again, we're not likely to be sort of going around our business like a sort of Trump or a Boris Johnson. So how might these sort of two extremes show up for the average person as they go about their day?
I think one of the most remarkable ways it shows up is in people's fear of public speaking. I've
Mm.
worked with so many
That
people over
already
the
occurred to me as my own personal
yeah.
example with regards to the deflated sovereign.
Gosh, I know people who are running, you know, businesses with many millions of pounds turnover and who dread standing up on and speaking in front of their staff. And
Mm,
I don't think I have yet met anybody who wasn't nervous before standing up at a wedding and making a speech, for
mm,
example. Now, is that a deflated sovereign? Well, I think it is, and I'll tell you why. I think way back in childhood, in the culture we live in, regrettably, many parents are so overloaded that they can't spare the time to encourage their children in those traits that would help them develop strong sovereignty. By
mm,
that I mean being seen, being listened to, being honoured for their presence. I mean, parents are quick to tell their children when they're doing something wrong, And I suppose in the early years of life, oh, he's a good boy, what a good girl. But again, that's being rewarded for doing something rather than the existential position of I'm just here. I'd like to hear some expression that affirms my existence,
Mm.
that actually I'm okay.
Yes, I
End
matter.
of story.
I'm loved. I'm accepted. Mm.
Yeah, because it's that builds sovereignty in the sense that it builds a strong sense of self-esteem, which is not, sorry, self-esteem more, I would say, is more based on what you can do, whereas self-worth is literally that. I
Hmm.
don't have to do anything to feel that I'm a worthy person, worthy of love, appreciation, honouring, respect. And that's where people, I think, are not really encouraged in childhood. You know,
Mm.
um,
Can I just jump
yeah.
in there? It feels to me, and I don't know
Hmm.
if you agree, and I don't mean this in a kind of conspiracy way at all. It's more just kind of the way of things, or certainly the way of things in this modern world. I think in order for our modern system, let's call it, to work, there it almost is, it needs to be built on this sense that people need to kind of do the right thing, fit in, be productive, be part of keeping the system going, in order for it to keep going. And so if there is this deep sense of our own intrinsic worth, I think there is this, and again, I think this is all happening at a subconscious level. I'm not saying this is like anyone sat and planned this out. Um, I think people would be making very different choices
Yeah.
than blindly kind of like being conditioned to fit into a system. So there is definitely this sense of, um, from a very early age, children being conditioned with reward and punishment to be and do in a certain way that is based on prioritizing that, as opposed to building that innate sense of I'm good enough just as I am, in whatever language
Yeah.
that is, that sense of
Absolutely.
wholeness, of worth, no matter what.
Regrettably, I think you're spot on. I think society has evolved into a place where it's extraordinarily difficult for parents to bring up children in a way that affirms their existence.
Mm,
For one thing, I'm coming to see how important it is for parents and children to spend a huge amount of time together in a
mm,
very kind of positive, loving way, far more, regrettably, than most parents can actually manage in the society
yes.
that we're living in.
Hmm.
I
I
know
agree.
several families where the children have not been conventionally educated at school. They've spent, because of the circumstances in which they're living, all day, every day with their parents. And they are some of the most delightful, charming, and very different children that I know. And you
Mm,
might say, well, of course they are, because their parents are so different. They're living outside the system. And that could be true. But I think it's got a lot more to do with the fact that there is this almost constant presence of the parents who are able to be relaxed and loving and with their children and spend
mm,
enjoyable time just being present with them and guiding them in every little thing and nuance of activity through the day, rather than coming home fractious from school and fractious from work and then immediately arriving in some kind of conflictual situation that destroys connection and affection and love.
mm.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you totally. And I don't have a remedy for that because, we're talking about something so structural. But I think the saving grace of it all is that those who are motivated to can develop a higher level of sovereignty if they set their minds to it.
Yes, that, as ever, it's a cliche, but it's like change starts with ourselves, and that's the wonderful thing. We don't need to sort of take on the whole world and see if we can make changes out there. We can absolutely start inside, which is the source of all change anyway.
Absolutely. So if I came to you as a client and said, look, my life's a mess, I just need help here, how would you start if that were the starting point? I just don't love myself. So here I am. What can you do for me? Where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, that's probably too long to go into, but ultimately, the work that we are very talking about here, without that, and again, whatever language you want to use for that, but that kind of internal structure that I think that for many, again, there is a really important discovery period that these energies that we're talking about do exist within, because we're in a culture where these things just aren't spoken about. There isn't a knowing that there is this sovereign within. So,
Absolutely.
just this very conversation, whether it takes place like this on a podcast or between um, a teacher and student, client and coach, I think that just recognition, like this is something I have within me and I can connect to and nurture and grow. I think that in itself is like such a powerful thing.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. But I'd like to just be a bit more specific because I think there is one key starting point for people in that position, and it's quite tangential, really. And it's finding self love,
Hmm.
because I regard that as the foundation of self worth and of being able to be confident in the world. But self love means self acceptance, and I don't see that many people who are fully accepting of themselves. And to be even more specific, I think what it really means is acceptance of the inner child and love of the inner
Mm.
child. For most people, there isn't even an awareness of that part of them, except, of course, when it erupts in a temper tantrum or some irrational behaviour, which leaves the person baffled. So, what did I do? What was I thinking? Well, the answer is you were not in charge of your inner world, and part of
Mm.
it burst out. So, to me, that's the key to everything. And
Yes,
if
wholeheartedly agree.
Thank you. And if business people come to me and say, I've got this, and this as an issue and I can't do with it and it's too much for me, I usually try and encourage them to start the work by looking at their relationship with the younger parts of themselves, because in a way it's the younger parts which can disrupt the expression of adult sovereignty, queenship, kingship, heart centered
Mm.
leadership.
Yes. Oh, I'm really glad we've taken it here. It seems funny actually that it's taken us so long to do so, but I think it's perfect. Um, and yes, I completely agree, and it feels to me the two go hand in hand in that recognition that there is this latent, in most people, this latent part that can be developed as this inner sovereign. But there's, for me, that goes hand in hand with this sense of like this inner parent, that there is someone actually finally to see, love, accept, guide that inner child. And so for me, there is something so profound in sort of both happening kind of like almost at once, where this is not at all intended as a criticism of other inner child work, because I think in any form it takes, it's so much better than not doing that work. um, but I think there is something very powerful about doing it from this understanding that there is a part inside that can act as the parent, that can act as the leader. That relationship between the two is really, as if we could boil it down to the simplest things, is like those two and the relationship between them that's like at the heart of all change, all healing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It really is. There's no question of that. We are equipped genetically to fulfill those roles, and it is easier to fulfill them when we've had a decent parent in our own childhood. But if we haven't had the benefit of that or even adequate parenting, we can still, as you've implied a moment ago, do the work later in life that will develop that inner love, compassion, heart centered quality between the wounded inner child and the parent part of us. And then everything can change. Everything does change. And of course, the trouble is, it requires commitment, it requires time. Well, the joy of it is, it requires commitment and time, just like bringing up a real physical child
Yes.
requires time and commitment. It's like the number of men, Leanne, the number of men I've worked with who've come to me and said things like, I don't understand why my child has suddenly started behaving so badly. I mean, he's been, great and really nice for 5 years, and now suddenly he's kicking off. And then the question becomes always, and what happened to you when you were 5? And generally they went through some trauma. And what happens later in life is that when their 5-year-old inner wounded child sees the external children, 5 years old, being well looked after, the inner child who didn't get so well looked after at 5-year-old starts kicking off and creating real problems for everybody because he's jealous.
Yes.
This is how real this is. It's
It
how
really
real
is. Yeah.
Yeah. I wish we could sort of put it into schools and bring it to everybody, but, fat chance. Fat chance.
Yeah, but hey, it has to start somewhere, and then it will ripple out, and it is rippling out.
Yes,
so
very much so.
in its own time, that will happen. So we are unbelievably kind of coming up on time, and I feel like, again, we've barely scratched the surface because we we keep kind of going deep down a rabbit hole, coming back up again. It's like, oh, hang on, we need to move along a bit. So before we finish, you tell me what you feel is really important that we now focus on.
You mean in this conversation now between us? Well, I was just thinking a good ending might be just to quickly run through, without necessarily analysing them in any detail, some of the really important qualities of the fullness of the heart-centred leader. Just simply to list them and maybe say a sentence or two about them. What do you reckon?
Yes, let's go for that. I can't promise I'll hold back from diving in to analyse them with you, but we'll see where we get to.
Yes, but you see, I love this. It's a bit like Alice in Wonderland, as you say, going down the rabbit hole. Look what a wonderful world she entered into. That was fantastic. And who doesn't love a good story? So, heart-centred leadership, well, that speaks for itself. We've already discussed that. But there's something more subtle about it, which is effective presence. And what that means is the effect that you have by your presence on other people. In other words, what's the tonality in the room where you are present? Do people start looking around and feeling edgy and anxious, or do they just relax and sort of become more open and comfortable? And, that's just about having that internal sense of, I am okay. In fact, I'm fine, whatever happens. And in fact, I'm so okay that I can be compassionate and loving and generous, which is not to say that a sovereign would avoid conflict. Of course, conflict sometimes is very necessary. Resilience, take the brickbats and keep on coming, and just say, okay, well, that's the way it is. I can be compassionate to the people who don't have my perspective. Affirming and blessing, that's particularly important for parents, of course. I think it was John Bradshaw. He wrote Homecoming, didn't he? The book on inner child work.
That's right, yes.
I think it was he who said, there's only 3 things a child needs to hear from their parent, and that they are, I love you, I'm proud of you, and you have everything you need to be a strong, loving woman or man. Those 3 things. Now, I think he's on to something, but it's not the whole story. I think a why is necessary. I love you because you have all you need to be a strong, loving woman because it contextualizes it. But you see the affirmation in that. Mentor and mentee, that if you are in a position of leadership, you're mentoring somebody, somewhere, somehow. If that's your own children, your employees at work, your friends, people in a sovereign circle, group of men or women or mixed gender group. And you also have a mentor yourself, somebody who can advise you and support you in kingship or queenship. Support network. Just out of interest, how many support or group circles have you been in your life, Leanne?
Oh my goodness. It's funny actually. This is very timely. Without going off onto another tangent, it's actually quite a timely question at the moment. But yeah, countless, absolutely countless. And I was reflecting as I was listening to you, how the kind of peers support, mentorship, um, that what we'll need that actually will support us, like, changes as we develop, that will change. And in some ways it's a really good clue as to where we are in terms of, like, what do we actually need, what have we outgrown, what have we left behind, what do we need now. And what I was just reflecting on is, at the moment, I've it's kind of happened almost organically, where a, a circle of women I'm in at the moment is focused very much more on our kind of spiritual path, and that be really the kind of reason we're together and working together. In a It's not in a kind of work capacity, but as in, like, there is a very clear understanding, like, that's why we're together, it's about our own spiritual path, and also the expression of that in our work. And that wouldn't have been necessarily the case however many years ago. I mean, I did have versions of that, but there is, again, a particular flavor, a particular depth, a particular type of support that we need, and it will change over time. But in
Beautiful.
direct answer to your question, yes, I have had many different circles of that kind over the years.
But what you've just put your finger on is so, so beautiful, because this is another intrinsic quality. Perhaps, after a period of experiencing sovereignty in its more practical forms, there is an evolution towards spirituality. And I think
Mm,
it's a real aspect of spirituality and personal development that people move in that direction. It doesn't have to be a consistent straight line. My own experience has been very much a kind of up and down curve. But the rationale is that to be a sovereign, you need a connection to something greater
mm,
than yourself. And that can be many things and come in many different forms. But it's certainly something that I would put under the heading of spiritual. So you
yes.
finger on absolutely something critical to fully developed sovereignty.
Mm,
And just to complete that brief list, there are some more practical ones: integrity, responsibility, and authenticity. I am who I say I am. If I do something wrong, if I break a commitment, I do something to put things right. I take responsibility for the consequences of my actions. And in that, when we're talking about deflated sovereigns earlier on, and I couldn't really think of anybody, you rightly mentioned people in business. And what has just come to mind as I talk about integrity and responsibility is the fact that I used to work for a chemical company, and they were obliged to report chemical leaks to the health and safety executive, obviously. And there was a set limit at which a leak or an accident had to be reported. And I think in the time I was there, which was 12 years, there were 3 or 4 of those. Then, not long before I left, I discovered purely by accident that every single day or week there was a leak, and they were never reported. These were leaks into canals and rivers where people would be paddling or playing. And when I thought about it, I could see that the reason for this, I regret to say, in one meeting where people were talking about a leak, I even found them laughing about it, which I assume in retrospect was because of their own embarrassment. But if
mm,
ever there were an example of deflated sovereignty, that was it.
mm.
And then the thought occurred to me, what happened to them when they drove through the factory gates in the morning that allowed them to abandon their sense of responsibility to their wives and children, or their husbands and children, or society as a whole, and go in and actively support, because that's what they were doing, this illegal activity of potentially dangerous, and in some cases very real dangerous, of pollution. And
Mm.
what happened when they drove out of the factory gates that turned them into decent family men and women who would care for their families? Extraordinary. But if ever there
Mm.
were an example of deflated sovereignty, that is it. And in fact, that brings
Yes.
to mind those who are brave enough to blow the whistle on such practices. We've seen that a lot in the
Mm.
NHS recently. And what happens to them? They're usually out of a job very soon. Then they have to
Mm.
fight for compensation. The culture is corrupt in that it doesn't reflect the values that a true sovereign embodies.
Mm.
Now, I'm not saying that's universal, and it's a rather extreme statement, but I think there's a huge amount of truth in it, that
Yes.
integrity is lacking in, and you see that, as you rightly said, in industry, particularly with the deflated
Mm.
sovereigns. And so that would bring us on to a few more, like being principled, knowing what you stand for, knowing when you have to speak up because you literally don't have a choice according to your own moral code.
Mm.
And of course, there are other things too that we could talk about. Lifelong learning, that actually you don't become. Remember Victor Meldrew? Did you ever see
Mm-hmm.
him?
Yes.
Yeah, the day he left his job, did he become a deflated sovereign? His life had no meaning. And of course, we had a great deal of laughs. If anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about, it's a TV comedy series from the early 2000s, I think.
Mm.
But Victor left his job and became a laughing stock because he had no purpose, he had no mission, he had nothing to do, and his life descended
Mm.
into chaos, a total deflation of sovereignty after he'd left his job. It was very funny though, I have to say. But of course, it's not funny if you happen to be the person living that life. Lifelong
Yes.
learning,
Mm-hmm.
that something about sovereignty is a lifelong commitment. And of course, that means embracing some purpose. Some purpose. We haven't really spoken much about purpose,
Mm.
but having a clear purpose. What am I here to do? You and I were talking before we began, and this question of what am I here to do came up between us, didn't it? I mean,
Mm.
if people don't know what they're here for on the planet at any stage of their life, then they don't have a guiding principle, I think. Or,
Mm. I think that's a really beautiful point to end with, and it's that question of whether we want to call it purpose or calling has become more and more kind of the sort of focal point, the North Star of the work that Jonathan and I do with people. I mean, it has now been the case for many years, but it was a kind of quite an organic thing that happened where we started to realize how foundational that was to so much else of someone's path. And that without that, it's very hard. I mentioned this in our last conversation, this notion of living fully and dying complete. I think that's probably impossible without that sense of kind of what I'm here to do. Um, but what we also realized is through that devotion to discovering one's purpose and living it out, it it naturally calls you into the very work that we're talking about and beyond. Like we just keep like the
absolutely.
more, because the more gets revealed, doesn't it? It's not a kind of often a sort of simple one liner that it's like never changes. It's like as soon as we start to touch into that sense of purpose and step into that, we discover more. You know,
Absolutely.
as you say, we were talking about this before we started recording, where I was sharing the work I'm doing right now in the Rose Quest and having this sense of, my goodness, this is the sort of deepest truth in terms of my soul's expression I've found so far. And
Beautiful.
that's been because of all these years of going deeper and deeper, and then more gets revealed, more gets revealed, more gets asked of me, but that then illuminates where my work lies, what more I need to reclaim, where we need to heal, where we need to expand. And so there's many other routes into this, but again, that's why for Jonathan and I, so much of our work now is centered around that, because it kind of calls everything else into the light, into our awareness to then take conscious action upon.
Absolutely. Oh, fantastic. I couldn't have put it better. It's a beautiful, beautiful description of a sovereign's evolution.
Mm,
And I do want to add, in case what you've just said frightens people, there's always discernment. You have a choice in the matter.
mm,
You have a choice in the matter. And the point about the sovereign's choice is it's an informed choice that's made from more impulses, knowledge, and wisdom in the present than perhaps your choices, in inverted commas, in the past have been,
mm.
which are more likely to have been driven by history and programming from other people and blah,
Mm.
blah, blah. But
Fear.
yeah, absolute
Hmm.
fear. Absolutely. But I think
Yeah.
that was beautiful. And I would sum it up by saying you're only ever given the challenges that you can cope with.
Mm.
Even if you think you can't, you haven't got a challenge facing you that you cannot cope with.
Yeah. Beautiful. Right. Well, I think we did what we intended to do, Rod. We kept that sort of sovereign sense of focus. And so where can listeners find out about more about you, your book, your work?
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I have this book, which I held up last time, Finding the King Within, and it is, in fact, very relevant to both genders. I wrote it for men because I perceive men are more lacking in sovereignty than women. That's the truth of it.
Hmm.
Now, that's an opinion. Whether it's right or not, I don't know. But perhaps a reason for that book being apparently oriented towards men is the fact that I don't see a lot of damage being done to the world by women. I see a lot
Hmm.
of damage being done to the world by men. And therefore, in my mind, if this can change at least some men's lives for the better, then I would be delighted with that. And there is another book which I can't immediately see that I'd like to recommend. It's an extraordinary book on relational healing. I've never come across anything quite so powerful and on point. So perhaps I can let you know the title and the author, and you could put it up in the notes afterwards. Would
Yes.
that be? Yeah,
More than
great
happy to
stuff.
do that. Yes.
Yeah,
Your
I
recommendations gratefully received.
well, thank you. It's a pleasure to see you again, as always. And so I think it just remains for us to say au revoir.
Yes, thank you so much, Rod. Again, this has been such a pleasure. I absolutely love where this journey took us. Thank you for being you and for doing the work you do. So appreciated.
Which I can only say straight back at you, really.
Mutual Appreciation Society.
Till next time.